Hello, everyone. We are mapping the political logic of the global anti-establishment revolt. Consider the architecture of standard democratic institutions. For decades, these frameworks operated as stable paradigms, absorbing societal shocks and maintaining a predictable equilibrium. Elections functioned smoothly within predefined boundaries, and foundational definitions of governance remained unchallenged. But what happens when the foundation cracks? We experience what is conceptually known as a populist moment. This is not a sudden aberration, but a dialectical axis shifting beneath our feet. The established order, which routinely processes routine grievances, suddenly encounters a rupture it cannot metabolize. Based on the analytical framework of JohnBJudis, we can trace the cartography of this explosion. A stable paradigm relies on a consensus between the governed and the governing. When that consensus shatters, the standard mechanisms of representation fail. The electorate no longer feels that tweaking policy at the margins is sufficient. Instead, they seek foundational breakthroughs. They demand a complete rewiring of the institutional apparatus. This cartography maps out how we arrived at this critical juncture. It is an exploration of the tectonic friction between entrenched institutional power and the raw, unmediated demands of a populace that feels entirely disenfranchised. The populist explosion is the physical manifestation of a systemic failure, an electoral moment where the polite fictions of standard democracy are stripped away. We must navigate this landscape not with moral panic, but with clinical precision, understanding that these anti establishment revolts are deeply rational responses to perceived betrayals by the reigning orthodoxies. Populism is a logic, not an ideology. It is a structural grammar of political grievance, a framework that can be mapped onto entirely different economic and cultural anxieties. We must dissect its two primary variants. Left wing populism champions a vertical divide. Imagine a sheer cliff face. At the bottom is the people, the middle and lower classes, the laborers, the debt burdened graduates. At the summit sits the elite, the upper echelon of political and economic power, the corporate boards, the establishment gatekeepers. The left wing mobilization is direct and binary, the bottom fighting the top to reclaim economic agency. But here is a catch. Right wing populism champions a triadic divide. It introduces a highly potent third dimension. In this geometry, the people still look upward with resentment at an elite establishment. However, they perceive this elite not just as hoarding wealth, but as actively coddling, funding, or prioritizing a parasitic third outgroup residing below them. Think of the modern suburban taxpayer, squeezed by stagnant wages, looking up at billionaire tax evaders, while simultaneously looking down at undocumented workers or welfare recipients whom they believe the elites are subsidizing with their tax dollars. The anger is multidirectional. The right wing populist mechanism thrives on this perception of an elite betrayal, where the establishment uses the resources of the working and middle classes to placate an outgroup. Understanding this geometric difference, the binary vertical versus the complex triadic, is absolutely essential for deciphering the modern political battlefield. It reveals why these movements, despite sharing an anti elitist vocabulary, pursue entirely divergent policy outcomes. Let us trace the anatomy of a systemic catalyst. Political eras are defined by grand consensuses. From 1932 to 1968, the New Deal consensus reigned, an architecture predicated on the state actively balancing the excesses of capitalism to protect the working class. But paradigms exhaust themselves. The neoliberal consensus emerged in the 1970s and dominated through the 2000s. Its broken promise is the root of our current instability. Neoliberalism promised universal prosperity through frictionless globalization, financial deregulation, and the optimization of supply chains. The reality engineered by these policies was profoundly asymmetrical. Massive global overcapacity, completely stagnating manufacturing profits, and explosive widening of domestic inequality. The system was functionally brittle. The trigger for the collapse was the 2008's Great Recession. This was not merely a financial crash, it was an epistemological rupture. The 2008 crisis brutally exposed the failure of the neoliberal consensus to the average citizen who witnessed bank bailouts juxtaposed against mass foreclosures. When dominant political ideologies collapse so spectacularly, populism emerges as the urgent diagnostic alarm. It is the systemic catalyst born from the wreckage of a shattered economic promise. The populist response is the friction generated when the lived reality of the populace directly contradicts the utopian projections of the reigning economic orthodoxy. It forces us to confront the structural decay that establishment politics deliberately obscured. The transition from the New Deal to neoliberalism, and finally to the crash, outlines a perfect historical trajectory of how a system incubates the very forces that will eventually rise to challenge its legitimacy. The American foundations of this vertical conflict run deep. We must examine the 1892's People's Party to understand the blueprint. Driven by crashing crop prices and the suffocating grip of railroad monopolies, this coalition of Southern and Western farmers united against what they termed the money power. They did not seek superficial tweaks. They championed radical structural reforms like a progressive income tax and nationalized railways. They recognized that the prevailing economic logic was engineered to extract their wealth. Jump forward to the Great Depression, and we encounter Huey Long and his Share Our Wealth movement in 1934. Explicitly weaponizing this vertical logic, Huey Long mobilized a middle class, completely terrified of falling into poverty. He directed their righteous anger squarely against the Rockefeller and Morgan elites. Long understood that abstract economic pain required concrete political targets. His demand for radical wealth redistribution was so potent, so deeply resonant with the anxieties of the masses, that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of the state. He forced Franklin D. Roosevelt to adopt the Second New Deal purely to absorb and neutralize the populist threat. These historical anchors are not anomalies, they are recurring systemic immune responses. When the concentration of capital reaches a critical threshold, threatening the material survival of the working and middle classes, the vertical populist mechanism activates. The logic deployed by the farmers in 1892s and by Huey Long in 1934s provides the exact conceptual architecture used by modern movements, seeking to dismantle entrenched elite monopolies and force a recalibration of the social contract. To understand the modern right-wing variant, we must analyze George Wallace and the Middle American Radical. In 1976's sociologist Donald Warren identified this specific demographic, the Mars. These were lower middle class, non-college educated whites who felt completely ignored by the political establishment. They occupied a precarious socioeconomic space, neither destitute enough for government aid nor affluent enough to navigate economic shocks. George Wallace pioneered modern right-wing populism by weaponizing this exact demographic anxiety. He initiated the Triadic shift. Wallace masterfully convinced the mass that the government apparatus was aggressively taxing the middle class to simultaneously subsidize both the wealthy elite above them and the minority or poor outgroups below them. Imagine the visceral frustration of a factory worker watching their purchasing power evaporate, believing their taxes fund corporate bailouts on Wall Street while simultaneously financing forced busing or affirmative action programs in their own neighborhoods. Wallace isolated this dual resentment. He articulated the mass demographic frustration, framing them as the forgotten, squeezed center, perpetually penalized for their own compliance with the social rules. This triadic framing is a psychological masterstroke. It redirects economic anxiety away from purely vertical class struggle and entangles it with cultural and racial grievances. By identifying the wealthy elites and the marginalized poor as a collaborative threat against the working center, Wallace provided the core conceptual architecture that would continuously fuel right-wing populist resurgences for decades to come, fundamentally altering electoral maps. The 1990s revealed the early cracks in the neoliberal facade. The dominant Clinton and Bush consensus was entirely structured around NAFTA, K Street lobbying, and aggressive financial deregulation. However, the surface-level economic boom masked deep structural rot. In 1992's, Ross Perot emerged as the center-left challenger. He mobilized independent voters by directly attacking the mechanics of the new economy, corporate outsourcing, the insidious influence of foreign lobbyists, and the exploding trade deficits. Perot argued simply, "We own this country," directly confronting corporate CEOs who were fixated solely on quarterly earnings rather than the long-term industrial health of the nation. Simultaneously, Pat Buchanan emerged as the right-wing challenger in 1992 and 1996. Buchanan weaponized the visual imagery of the pitchfork rebellion against the establishment. He channeled the cultural and the economic anxieties of the Middle American radicals regarding free trade agreements and unchecked immigration. While Perot focused on the balance sheet, Buchanan integrated cultural protectionism, previewing the exact electoral map and rhetoric of 2016's. Both challengers, operating from different flanks, diagnosed the identical pathogen, a transnational elite consensus that was actively liquidating the domestic manufacturing base. They proved that the neoliberal paradigm, despite its apparent absolute dominance in Washington, was creating a vast reservoir of disenfranchised voters. Perot and Buchanan were the early seismic tremors, indicating that the working and middle classes were beginning to recognize that the promises of globalization were inherently asymmetric, heavily punishing the domestic worker to reward a multinational corporation. The 2008's financial crisis and the subsequent bailouts caused a complete bipartisan fracture. The systemic failure of the banking sector forced the government to reveal its true priorities. The state intervened to save the financial institutions responsible for the crash, while allowing millions of average citizens to face foreclosure and ruin. The right reaction materialized as the Tea Party. This movement was fueled by a profound, visceral anger over the Obama administration bailing out what they perceived as takers, underwater homeowners, at the direct expense of the makers, the responsible middle class. It was an aggressive return to Jacksonian producerism, a strict moral accounting that divided society into those who produce value and those who parasite off the state. Conversely, the left reaction manifested as Occupy Wall Street. This was a direct, vertical retaliation against the absolute lack of accountability for financial elites. They framed the conflict strictly as the 99% vs the 1%, engineering a surgical attack on the political and economic inequality inherent in the neoliberal model. Both movements, despite their polar opposite ideologies, were birthed from the exact same institutional betrayal. The 2008 S crash shattered the illusion of a meritocratic economy. It proved to the populace that risk was socialized for the elites, while ruin was entirely privatized for the working class. The bipartisan fracture meant that the establishment center could no longer hold the narrative. The flanks had broken away, armed with distinct, uncompromising diagnoses of systemic corruption. By 2016, this populist logic became fully institutionalized. The Washington establishment found itself besieged from both sides. On the left, Bernie Sanders mobilized the college-educated McGovern generation. These voters were facing unprecedented downward mobility, suffocating student debt, and chronically stagnant wages. Sanders utilized pure vertical conflict. He demanded a political revolution to violently reclaim democracy from the billionaire class through massive wealth redistribution. His target was Wall Street. His solution was universal expansion. On the right, Donald Trump weaponized the silent majority of working class whites devastated by deindustrialization. Trump masterfully utilized the triadic logic. He aggressively blamed corrupt globalist elites for actively stripping American wealth to coddle foreign nations and illegal immigrants. His narrative fused economic anxiety with cultural displacement. The establishment elite, completely anchored to the neoliberal status quo, possessed no counter-narrative to these raw structural critiques. Sanders diagnosed the holding of capital as the apex. Trump diagnosed the hemorrhage of capital across borders and the influx of foreign labor at the base. Both candidacies proved that the old left-right spectrum was dead. The new axis was the establishment versus the anti-establishment. 2016 was the moment the diagnostic alarms triggered by the 2008 crash manifested into dominant electoral forces, proving that the populist logic had officially superseded traditional partisan ideology as the primary driver of political mobilization. We turn our analytical lens to the European pressure cooker. The systemic trap here operates differently than in the United States. European populism reacts primarily to a profound loss of national sovereignty. The architecture of the European Union, specifically the Eurozone, stripped nations of their monetary sovereignty. They can no longer devalue currency to manage domestic crises. Furthermore, the Troika, comprising the ECB, EU, and IMF, enforces strict austerity measures from Brussels, completely bypassing domestic democratic mandates. Simultaneously, social democratic and labor parties fully embraced neoliberalism and EU integration, essentially abandoning their traditional working class bases. The ignored grievances compounded rapidly. As the Troika enforced brutal economic austerity across southern Europe, dismantling welfare systems to pay off sovereign debt, Northern Europe was absorbing millions of immigrants without any foundational cultural consensus. Traditional center-left and center-right parties offered absolutely no alternatives to this trajectory. They functioned as mere administrators of Brussels directives. This created a massive, highly combustible political vacuum. Imagine a populist told that their economic suffering is a mathematical necessity dictated by foreign bankers, while simultaneously experiencing rapid demographic shifts in their neighborhoods. The pressure cooker metaphor is precise. With the safety valves of national monetary policy and the responsive domestic representation permanently sealed shut, the structural pressure builds relentlessly until a populist eruption becomes the only available mechanism for democratic expression. The European right capitalized on this vacuum by weaponizing welfare, chauvinism, and sovereignty. The strategy is critical. European right-wing populists completely abandoned pure free market economics. They expanded their electoral base by promising to fiercely protect the generosity of the social democratic welfare state, but strictly and exclusively for native-born citizens. In France, the Front National, under Marine Le Pen and Florian Philippot, aggressively adopted economic nationalism. They demanded protective tariffs, fiercely rejected the euro, and called for heavily reducing immigration to protect French workers from global labor arbitrage. In Denmark, the Danish People's Party capitalized on deep cultural anxieties rather than purely economic ones. They asserted the sociological truth that high-tax welfare systems rely entirely on deep societal trust and cohesion, which they argue is rapidly eroded by non-integrating immigrants. In the UK, UKIP, driven by Nigel Farage, successfully engineered the Brexit vote. Farage mobilized the working class left behinds against the distant technocratic Brussels establishment. He framed the European Union not just as an economic burden, but as an existential threat to national identity and economic security. This is the Triadic logic operating in Europe. The native working class fighting an arrogant transnational elite that they perceive is actively prioritizing the integration of a massive immigrant outgroup at the expense of domestic stability. Simultaneously, the European left engineered the anti-austerity revolt. This movement was heavily influenced by the profound theoretical work of Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe. In Spain, Podemos utilized this intellectual core to completely redefine the political boundary. They discarded the obsolete left versus right dichotomy, replacing it with La Casta, the entrenched, corrupt establishment caste versus La gente, the suffering people. This redefinition allowed them to capture widespread rage against economic stagnation. In Greece, Syriza experienced the rise by ascending to power on a ferocious promise to tear up the Troika's punishing austerity memorandums, which had reduced the Greek economy to rubble. However, they soon encountered the governance trap. Left populism faces a brutal, strict limit when confronting transnational financial architecture. Once in power, Syriza was financially asphyxiated and forced to completely surrender to European creditors merely to keep Greece in the Eurozone. They abandoned their populist mandate and tragically transformed into a standard center-left administrator, enforcing the very austerity they swore to destroy. Podemos similarly diluted its radical platform in pursuit of a parliamentary coalition. The governance trap demonstrates the lethal friction between domestic democratic mandates and the iron logic of international capital. It proves that left populism can easily win elections by diagnosing the pain, but structural constraints often neutralize its capacity to execute the cure, leading to rapid disillusionment among the populace. This brings us to the diagnostic matrix, a tool to categorize the variants of populism based on their distinct operating mechanisms. The US left, epitomized by Sanders, operates on a purely vertical conflict. The primary elite target is the billionaire class and Wall Street. There is no outgroup target. Their view of the welfare state is to expand it universally, such as Medicare for all. The US right, seeing Trump and the Tea Party, utilizes triadic conflict. Their elite target is globalists and Washington insiders, while their primary outgroup targets are illegal immigrants and the perceived undeserving poor. Their objective is to dismantle welfare for the poor while violently protecting it for the middle class, the Mars. The EU left, like Podemos and Syriza, relies on vertical conflict against the Troika and La Casta, possessing no outgroup. They seek to protect the welfare state from imposed neoliberal austerity. Finally, the EU right, including the Front National and the UKIP, operates on triadic conflict. They target Brussels bureaucrats and view non-European immigrants and refugees as the outgroup. They seek to protect the welfare state fiercely, but strictly for native citizens, enforcing welfare chauvinism. This matrix proves that while all populisms share an anti-elite architecture, their targets and policy outputs are radically divergent based on historical and material conditions. Ultimately, populism is an early warning system. We must discard the hysterical comparisons. Unlike 1930s fascism, modern populism does not seek imperial expansion, the dissolution of parliaments, or the overthrow of democracy. It operates strictly and deliberately within electoral systems. Its true function is to act as a political catalyst and a diagnostic alarm. It flashes red on the dashboard of history, signaling that a dominant political paradigm, specifically neoliberalism, has utterly failed to deliver on its foundational promises and is collapsing under its own contradictions. It is the final warning. When major traditional parties willfully ignore rising systemic inequality, the catastrophic loss of national sovereignty, and the brutal disintegration of the working class, populist eruptions become mathematically inevitable. They force the entrenched establishment into a binary choice: either rapidly adapt to the genuine material demands of the people or be completely replaced by them. As we rapidly accelerate into the AI era, where algorithms and automation threaten to displace human labor and consolidate wealth at an unprecedented exponential scale, this populist diagnostic alarm will only grow louder. The tension between technocratic efficiency and human dignity will dictate our future. Thank you. See you next time.